I would see online, some people would be like, oh, I coded for 8 hours today. And I just couldn't imagine even doing that. All I ever saw was like screenshots of colorful text against a black background. However, I started reading and getting into self-improvement a little bit. And that's where I started to understand that look how many people have been successful at things where they said they were terrible before they began. And then they just started working away at it. If I went to, let's say, a bar with my friend and there was a piano there, and all of a sudden he just played this amazing piece on the piano, I would be shocked because I'd been hanging around with him every day for the last 10 years. And I'll be like, how could you do that? And then if he had said, oh, it just came to me, I'd be really shocked. But then if he had said to me, oh, no, I practice 4 hours every day after school for the last 10 years, I'll still be impressed, but I wouldn't be shocked. So it's that same hypothesis where, okay, just put in the hours and you will get good. And then if you have that internal drive to keep putting in more hours and learning in a very smart way, you will get really good and just see how far you can take it.
This episode of Ken's Nearest Neighbors is powered by Z by HP. HP's high compute, workstation-grade line of products and solutions. Today, I had the pleasure of interviewing Nash Mundondo. Nash thought he could never learn to code. At 16, he dropped out of his high school computer science class, and at 23, he dropped out of his sports science master's because it had one coding module, and he thought he couldn't handle it. Now, there's nothing he loves more than coding and data science. He's currently documenting his journey on YouTube to show others who think that they either can't code or can't learn data science, that if he can do it, they can too. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm excited for you to hear from Nash yourselves. Nash, welcome to the Ken's Nearest Neighbors podcast. I came across your content on YouTube. We've had a couple offline discussions, and I'm really happy to have you on to share your journey, talk about how you landed your internship, why you started creating content, all these wonderful things. So again, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to this. And yeah, as somebody who's been watching the podcast and your main channel as well for a while, yeah, it's really exciting to be here.
Amazing. So something, as I'm sure you know, we do to get everyone familiar with the guests is we talk about how you first got interested in data. So was your first interaction with data, was it a pivotal moment or was it more of a slow progression over time?
It was definitely more of a slow progression because growing up as a kid, I always liked maths and that sort of thing, but I never knew what sort of career you could have with maths besides mathematician, because that's really the only thing that I knew. But I was always into sports and tennis in particular. Before all the matches, they would bring up the player's stats against a specific player or their general stats. And for some reason, that always really excited me. I loved just digging into them. And I found that after a while, without even trying, I had memorized all of these stats and I would sort of correlate them with what was going on in the match. But then I didn't know that could be a potential career path. I thought it was just this weird geeky thing. So I sort of just forgot about that for a little bit. But then when I was getting towards the end of my high school career, the field of big data, as it was called back then, was emerging, but it wasn't that mainstream yet. So I was trying to decide what to study between sports science, big data, or business. And I really did think about studying big data at the beginning, but it was still very, very much an emerging field, at least in my opinion, because I didn't have that broad of an awareness. So I decided to do sports science instead, right? But when I started studying that degree in sports science, that's when data science became big. And I could just tell that it was something that I would have an affinity for just because I loved numbers. I loved statistics when I was in high school and that sort of thing. But I'd already committed to sports science. So I ended up having to finish my undergraduate in that. And then I did everything in my power to then move to studying data science as a master's, as a conversion master's, which is basically what I've been doing for the last 2 years, 3 years, if you include my failed self-taught stint.
So tell me a little bit of what is sports science, just for those that aren't initiated? How different is it from data science? And then also maybe how did you make that decision to go into sports science?
Sports science and data science have a lot in common in terms of that they're quite broad. So there's so many different wormholes you can go down. So you have things like sports physiology, which is basically looking at how exercise affects the body. That's if you're doing it more as general population, exercise to prevent disease and that sort of thing. But more my interest was working in elite sports. So this would be in terms of injury prevention, making players a little bit faster, and just basically looking into training resumes. So that would be more of the strength and conditioning side, which is something that I was really big into. So it's basically using exercise on the body in order to improve sporting or health performance.
Amazing.
And
Obviously,
yeah,
there's probably a lot of crossovers between that and data science now, probably less
yes.
so historically. I mean, that's a pretty interesting intersection. So why don't you walk me down again how there were these two sort of paths before you. I think your parents also might have had a little bit of input here, but how did you choose um, you know, going down that sports science route, but also how did you decide to eventually move towards data science? Like, what was the moment you were like, oh, I need to make this switch for myself and for my career? Because that probably isn't easy.
Sure. So I was always into sports basically since I was a young kid. No matter what the sports was, whether it was cricket, whether it was football, whether it was tennis, what have you, I just love sport. So, but I was pretty decent at a few academic subjects. So towards the end of high school, I did not have a clue what exactly I wanted to study, but I knew that I was passionate about sports. And back then, I was big on the passion hypothesis that, okay, I love doing this thing. If I work in this thing, I will be happy. And as a result, it was between that, business studies, which I wasn't as passionate about, and then big data, or let's just call it data science anyway. Um, so I was trying to think of which one to pursue. And then my parents have always been very supportive of me, and they knew that I love sports. And data science was still very much emergent back home. So they weren't too sure what exactly it was. They would have been fine with me studying that as well, but they just weren't. It wasn't as established. And they knew, okay, this kid loves sports. So they gave me the freedom to choose, and they gave me a little nudge towards the sports science direction. And I was like, okay, great, I'm doing sports science. I love this field. I love sports. This is going to be great. So then I started my undergraduate, and I guess to know how I got into data science, I'll have to know how I ended up not wanting to pursue sports science, which is basically, I realized about a year into it, if not even sooner than that, okay, just because I love watching sports does not mean I love sports science, because it turns out that I'm not too much into the physiology of things. I'm not too concerned with making a player run zero point zero zero 0.001 seconds faster. However, I was committed to finishing sports science. I was like, okay, I could do something with this after I graduate. I could be a freelance sports scientist and that sort of thing. So what happened is, after I graduated, I started doing that freelance sports science work, and it was a combination of working with teams, but then on my own time, when let's say teams weren't training, I would be being a personal trainer. And that is probably the turning point when I realized this career is not for me, because I had one client, my first ever client as a personal trainer. We had two sessions. So he was trying to go on a weight loss journey to get healthier, which was great. So we had two sessions, and I had designed this intricate program for him that would, progressive overload, all of these different factors. And then after one of the sessions, he asked me, "Oh, this is going great." And he mentioned that he had gone out the day before and had like 18 beers. And I was like, okay, 18 beers is like, I don't know how many thousand calories. You've undone all the work that we've done. So you kind of have to make a choice. How hard do you want to go towards your goal? And he was like, oh, I want to reach my goal, but I really like going out. And then that's when I realized, okay, I can't work for the rest of my life depending on other people to do what I tell them to do. I really wanted to focus that locus of control more close towards me. So that's when I realized, okay, sports science is out of the equation. And at this stage, data science was now booming. That's when I had been following channels like yours for a little bit and seeing, oh, wow, you can use data science within sports. Oh, you can use it within any field. That's interesting. But then I was thinking, okay, I would have to go back and do another undergraduate. Oh, I would be so old by the time I graduated. But then I began to see more and more people who maybe didn't even go to university and just went the self-taught route and straight away became a data scientist. And then there were more universities willing to offer a conversion master's where it's like, okay, you did something different for your undergraduate, but we'll take you onto data science, put you on this accelerated course. The one problem was that my parents wanted me to do my master's in sports science because I started this, and they're big on finish what you started. So then I started my master's in sports science in Germany, and after like 2 months, I got that same feeling that I had all those years ago in my sports science class, in my undergraduate, where it was like, this is not for me. But then this time I took the leap of faith. I dropped out of university. That was a very difficult conversation to have with my parents, but I had researched data science. I had started learning the very basics of it, and had realized, like, okay, this is something where, excuse me, if I simply put enough time, I could get to a good level in this. And I'd moved from that passion mindset to more of a mastery mindset, where I now believed, okay, enough directed effort and enough time goes by, you can learn pretty much anything. So I decided, okay, data science is where I'm going to apply all this energy within me.
That's so cool. And it's interesting you talk about having that conversation with your parents. That's something I do a lot. Is my parents might not necessarily agree with the decisions I make, and historically they've been really against things. But one thing I realized is that if I had very well had thought something out very clearly, if I showed them that I had a plan, they were significantly more inclined to not object to what I was doing. And
Yeah.
it comes down to what a lot of our parents fear is, oh, they're just doing this irrationally, they're just jumping into this, they're following the next trend, they haven't thought this through at all, and they're jeopardizing their future because of this. But by presenting your parents with some structure, clearly showing them that you've done your research, that's something, at least for me, really got my parents off my back, and I think might be a tip for a lot of people who are making career changes or doing things that aren't in line with what our parents believe. I mean, fortunately, my parents have been pretty open to me doing what I want. I mean, they're both doctors,
Yeah.
and I did not go the medical route, but I think that once they saw that I at least sort of knew what I was doing, that was
Yeah.
really powerful in that. And obviously, I think you know what you're doing. You've landed an internship. You're working through this in a really effective way, and that's something that also adds fuel to that fire. And eventually, we don't care what our parents think, but I'm still not there yet,
Yeah.
and I'm 33 years old. So
I think I'm reaching that turning point where it's like, okay, I'm going to have to live with my decisions. I'm willing to take the wrath from my parents if it doesn't work out, because I've tried to research it. I'm acting on the best of my knowledge, but it is always an awkward conversation to have, for sure.
So before we dive into your journey of learning data science, going through courses, and now going back for a degree, can you tell me what you've learned about that passion hypothesis that you were talking about earlier on? Has your
Yeah.
philosophy on that changed? Has it evolved, adapted? Because that's something I think is really useful and interesting to break down a little bit.
Mm. I would say it hasn't changed specifically, but it's just that I went from a lack of awareness to having awareness. So growing up as a kid, I just always assumed that people who were good at certain things, it was because of talent or because they loved it so much. So naturally, that's why I ended up studying sports science, because I was like, okay, I love this. And I was so afraid of coding as a teenager. So I figured, okay, so that's just something I can't do because I just don't have that gift, or I'm not passionate about it. Because I would see online some people would be like, oh, I coded for 8 hours today, and I just couldn't imagine even doing that. All I ever saw was like screenshots of colorful text against a black background. However, I started reading and getting into self-improvement a little bit, and that's where this hypothesis of, well, not a hypothesis, this philosophy where of mastery, which is just working towards something and knowing that there's no finish line to it, but just trying to get as good at it as possible, which is basically what mastery is. It came to me basically where I started to understand that look how many people have been successful at things where they said they were terrible before they began, and then they just started working away at it. And just having that awareness, it's like I sat down one day and I was like, okay, if I coded for 6 hours every day for 3 years, just hypothetically, I suck at coding right now. I don't even know what coding is. But if I put in 6 hours every day for 3 years, would I be good? I was like, well, of course, I've put in that much time. And just those simple thought patterns began to reveal to me that, okay, any skill can be learned. And with the time and directed effort, which is the important part, not just doing whatever, you will get good at a certain thing. And there's always this one example I give myself, which is another hypothetical. I love hypotheticals, if you haven't noticed yet. But basically, if I went to, let's say, a bar with my friend and there was a piano there, and all of a sudden he just played this amazing piece on the piano, I would be shocked because I'd been hanging around with him every day for the last 10 years. And I'll be like, how could you do that? And then if he had said, oh, it just came to me, I'd be really shocked. But then if he had said to me, oh, no, I practice 4 hours every day after school for the last 10 years, I'll still be impressed, but I wouldn't be shocked. So it's that same hypothesis where, okay, just put in the hours and you will get good. And then if you have that internal drive to keep putting in more hours and learning in a very smart way, you will get really good and just see how far you can take it.
I'd like to take a quick second to thank one of our sponsors, Pathrise. Job hunting can be daunting, particularly in today's unpredictable world. Pathrise matches you with a dedicated mentor in your field to provide tailored support throughout your job search journey. From optimizing your resume and application process to mastering your interview skills, their expert guidance prepares you to secure your dream job and to negotiate a competitive salary. The cherry on top is that you don't pay until you secure that high-paying job that you've been aiming for. Don't hesitate. Visit pathrise.com/KenG to get matched with an expert mentor today. This episode of Ken's Nearest Neighbors is brought to you by Z by HP, HP's high compute, workstation grade line of products and solutions. Z is specifically made for high performance data science solutions, and I personally use the ZBook Studio and the Z8 workstation. I really love that the Z workstations can come standard with Linux or WSL2, and they can be configured with the Data Science Software Stack Manager. With the Software Stack Manager, you can get right to the work of doing data science on day one without the overhead of having to completely reconfigure your new machine. Now back to our show. That's something that just seeing how far you can take it, but also just dedicating time to something and seeing how good you can get is something that I've been thinking about a lot. So I saw this video. I think it's Jesse Isler, but it's the guy who had David Goggins come to his house and lived with him for 30 days. He gives this talk, and admittedly I saw it on Instagram or TikTok, but he talks about if you do something for 20 minutes every day, it's not a lot of time over the course of a year, but over the course of a year, you'll be better. I'm roughly approximating this, so don't direct me quote on this, but you'll be better than 90% of people at whatever you're doing. So if you code for 20 minutes a day, you'll be better than 90% of people. Admittedly, 90% of people probably don't code at all, but there's still that idea that you can make substantial gains on other people by just dedicating time to something. And if you're evaluating against a benchmark of, for example, everyone, you're probably already better at coding than you think. I mean, if you're looking against the population or the US or against these things, I mean, if you can write a couple lines of Python, you're already in the top maybe 3 or 4% of people in general at
Yeah.
coding. So so when you frame it that way, it's all about perspective, and making gains relative to that maybe isn't as hard as you think either. Um, I also want to sort of hone in on the idea that if you dedicate time, or you find something that you're interested in enough to dedicate that time, you can get dramatically better. So I think your initial experience with passion was, hey, I'm interested in sports, I'm going to explore that, and I'm going to focus in on that. I think that that's fine, but I think a huge component of it of is experimentation. So you should use
Mm.
your passion to find what interests you and experiment within that domain, because inevitably there's going to be things within the sports domain, for example, that you don't like.
Yeah.
Inevitably there's going to be subcategories or paths that you're not super excited about. But within a domain like sports science, there also is very likely something that gets you super excited and obsessed. And that could be the data portion of sports science, which you've already learned about yourself is interesting. And that means that you
Sure.
can sort of branch off and follow a more directed route towards getting to that. And I think so many people forget how important experimentation is. For example, my parents, they're like, "Oh, you do this thing and it doesn't work." But or I have a lot of doctor friends, right, that are in medical school and they hate it, but they're screwed because they can't experiment. They're stuck
Yeah.
within this one field. If they had dialed it back, maybe in college a little bit, and focused on, hey, what specialties am I interested in? Am I even interested in medicine? Maybe I'm interested in helping people and interested in health, but a medical degree is a massive time commitment. It's a massive income commitment. It's a lot of there's a lot of overhead associated with it. I'm not
Yeah.
saying people shouldn't become doctors. I mean, there's plenty of people that it is their livelihood, but there's also plenty of people that regret it because you're in too far deep. So I really am interested, and I think it's important for people to create these low stakes experiments so that you can figure out where to pursue that mastery in the longer term. Not the most efficient way for me to say that, but I think I got to where I wanted to go.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, yeah, I 100% agree with that experimentation thing because I guess mine was just an extended experiment with sports science. Although I perhaps took a slightly different route after that because I just went all in on the data. I didn't experiment with too much other stuff. I had just gotten into the mindset of I don't really care what it is, but I'm going to direct all my energy towards it. And I knew it'd either be software engineering or data science, but just because I had that pre existing love for data, I went with that. But I do know most people do need a little bit more experimentation. So I agree with that point.
Yeah. Well, there's also the side where it's explore versus exploit. There's
Mm.
a certain period where if you know, or if you're certain enough, you should start exploiting, because the return comes from exploitation. You don't really get a return on experimentation outside of
Mm.
figuring out what you want to exploit. So you have a really important part of this equation is figuring out when you do want to make that switch. And it seems like you already knew you were interested in data. It was just a matter of, hey, I'm deciding to dedicate to this instead of focusing more solely on the sports science stuff. And to be fair, I don't think the careers are that dissimilar. It's that, hey,
Yeah.
you're that much more excited about one. I would also imagine the data domain, the return on investment is probably consistently a little bit higher. I would
Yeah.
there's people in sports science that I'm sure do very, very well, but I would imagine on average a data or technical skill set probably
Yeah.
does a little bit more consistently better, whether it's financially or freedom of work or not having to work with individual people
Yeah.
as consistent clients in the same way that you do with being a personal trainer. So, I'm interested in that self learning that you talked about. So you saw people self learning, but inevitably you did try to pursue, or you're pursuing another degree. What made that? What's the mechanics of that decision?
Of going from self learning to a degree.
Yeah.
Okay, so essentially what it was is that I always knew that I was going to do the degree in the end. But of course, there was the pandemic, which basically I decided to delay my intake by a year. But I didn't want to waste a year just sort of sitting at home. So I decided, okay, I'm going to go the self taught route. And my hope was that I would do so well self taught that the degree was just a formality that would pretty much just look more impressive on my CV. However, that is not the way that things went because initially what I did was just go on YouTube and look at people walking through projects, the simple tutorials, and none of it made any sense to me. So I decided, okay, some people are capable of going self taught completely. That might not be me. I need a little bit more structure. So I looked for an online
Hold
course,
on.
which was,
So you're
yeah.
saying my tutorials don't make any? No, I'm just kidding.
I was like, Ken, explain this more. No, you're. To be fair, one of the first tutorials I saw was your predicting NBA games with Python ones, and I literally just saw the title and the thumbnail, and my brain just sort of melted. I didn't have the heart to click on it. I just thought to myself, okay, I can't jump to that. Let me do baby steps. But what it ended up with was me going to data camp, and I was like, okay, great. I've seen data camp ads everywhere, and what could go wrong? I'm learning in a directed manner. So I load up data camp, and initially I am learning, and you know those initial phases, you pick up so much in the first few weeks that you didn't know. So it's like exponential learning. And then after a while, I would get to trickier topics. Let's say, I don't know, for loops. And then, which, when you're starting is quite tricky, I would kind of understand what's going on, but not really. But then the thing with DataCamp, no hate against DataCamp, but with online courses in general, is that it was a very much fill in the blank. So you would watch a little bit of a video where they would explain what a for loop is and how it works. And then the next question would be like for dash in dash. And then you just had to fill in the blanks and run it. And then it would run. So I would do that and I'd think, wow, I'm really good at this stuff. I'm breezing through this. And I never took the time to pause to do my own self-directed projects because it's also a little bit gamified. So what that means is you're incentivized to keep going forward and keep building your streaks, especially because if you wanted to do a lesson again, you kind of have to reset the whole thing and you don't get your points back. But so what would happen is that I would just keep going forward in this learning, but none of it was taking hold because I was just going on to the next thing. So what happens is a few modules down the line, it's assumed that because you learned for loops before, you now know all of that. And the focus is now on something else. So that bit with the for loops is now filled in for you. And it's now the next thing that you have to fill in, let's say how to do functions and use them in a loop. So this pretty much happened for 8 months where I thought I was learning things and I was not. By the end of it, I just sort of knew that, okay, a list has square brackets. That's something. So I would know what it looks like, but I didn't comprehend what it is and why we care about it. Just because the projects, I didn't take the time to slow down and do projects myself. So fast forward, and now it's university time. So it's a conversion master's. So firstly, I assume that nobody has done any coding before because we're all on a conversion course. So I walk in feeling pretty good about myself, like, oh, I've done all this self-learning. I've done a whole data camp course. This is going to be a breeze. And literally my first programming class where it was a graded assignment that counted for like 30% or 40% of our grade, I failed it horrifically. And it wasn't for a lack of trying, by the way. I realized pretty early that I was in trouble and that I had learned nothing and had pretty much just wasted the last 8 months of my life. And I would spend hours, 8 hours in the library because this was before ChatGPT and what have you, where you could get a little bit of help. And even on Stack Overflow, I couldn't understand what was going on. So I'd spend hours and it just wouldn't work. I would spend hours and nothing ever changed. So when I got that grade back, that's when I realized that I literally knew nothing about coding and basically deprogrammed myself from everything I had learned. And instead of spending those hours trying to complete the assignment, I just spent those hours basically relearning how to program so that I could at least pass that class and wouldn't have to do a reset.
So how did you relearn programming differently this second time around?
So the first thing is that now it wasn't just data camp. I was using the university resources to learn, which was actually really useful because one thing that my university does well or did well is that everything that we learned was so applicable to the real world. Like literally as soon as you left uni, you could use that in the real world. So I just watched all the lectures slowly, one by one, not rushing to try and find a solution. And of course, I had mates who were a lot better at programming than me, who would also explain a couple of elements to me. And then just it was a matter of once again putting in those hours, but now not just rushing to finish a course because that was no longer the motivation. The motivation was now comprehension so that you could pass this graded coursework well and eventually get a job. So it was a lot more grounded in reality. And learning to think programmatically was one of the things that helped me the most because I never realized how abstract programming can be, especially for data science, because you kind of have to keep in mind like, okay, so I've done this to the data set, which means it has changed like this because I wasn't using my print statements effectively at all. So I had to store everything in my head. So thinking more abstract in order to understand the more solid data was a big helper, if that makes any sense.
No, that makes sense. I think a lot of online courses really focus on pattern matching or,
Mm,
hey, you have to remember the syntax. I mean, theory is described and then you sort of, as you mentioned, are filling in the blanks. You
yeah.
know, I've created what, 3 courses now, and that's something that I realized pretty early on is, oh my goodness, you know, I don't want to be making things that are going to be watched and thrown away. So something I've really enjoyed doing, or I've enjoyed seeing people do, is rather than building courses to quickly acquire a skill,
Hmm.
I've switched my focus towards making courses that are useful as a reference. So,
Mm,
hey, I learned this topic, but I don't remember it that well. Where can I go for a refresher? To me, that's a significantly more effective way to teach. I mean, I don't particularly want to be the person that teaches the intro course to get going because that's a very hard task, as you described. Everyone's coming in at different levels. Everyone's coming in with, like a different way of interpreting and learning things. But if you're coming in as in the reference side, I think it's a lot more effective, and that really encourages people to be using these things. You know,
yeah.
references and examples to me are the most effective way after you've acquired that initial knowledge to really build on that. Um, so if anyone is interested in the courses I produced, minor plug. But with that being said, I think that what you described is with the cohort learning, learning as a group is something that's very compelling. I'm interested in who do you think would be a good fit for a transition master's in data science and who it might not be a good fit for, because I have pretty strong opinions that I don't believe master's degrees are necessary, especially in the
Yeah.
US. They're very cost prohibitive. But I
Mm.
also have 2 master's degrees myself, so it's a little hypocritical uh, for me to come from that angle, because I do have that experience. I do have the benefits that are associated with them. So, someone who's sort of in the thick of it now, what is your perspective on that?
That's very interesting. I would say that first of all, I can only speak for the master's course that I have done, which was very much tailored to people who had no coding experience at all. So, actually, as one of the requirements is that you can't have done computer science or what have you as an undergrad, and now you're trying to transition to data science. So, it's completely for newbies. But what I would say is that a conversion master's is really good for somebody who loves structure, they can't self teach and they need some sort of instruction to help them along the way. They are also very motivated because there will be a heavy workload. It was a lot of I had a lot of friends doing masters as well in different degrees where they had done the same undergrad. So they had a lot more free time, maybe two, three times the amount of free time, probably because I couldn't code very well, but they had a lot more free time. So you have to be willing to put in a lot of hours, especially if you have not coded at all before. And it is also for people who, I still think, at least in the UK, having a master's degree does have some weight to it. So people who do value, it's not necessarily about the master's, but having a degree rather than just being self-taught, it still does have some weight to it. So people who still very much value that aspect. So I'd say it's best suited for people who fall into that category.
Amazing. It's funny you said something in there that really made me perk my ears up. So people that crave structure, I
Mm.
historically was one of those people. That's why I went back and did a master's degree, because I didn't feel like any of the resources. This is before most of the online learning platforms were available or widely available for
Mm.
data science. But I felt like there wasn't enough structure for me to go about a learning path. I
Yeah.
think after I I did a computer science with a specialization in AI and machine learning. So after I did
Mhm.
that and have worked as a data scientist now, I feel like
Yeah.
I could, or I've developed the skill set to create structure for myself. So it's very interesting is that while I did do those programs, the data science skill set that I developed allows me to go back and create self-learning in the longer term. So it's sort of this meta loop that's created that, I mean, maybe I couldn't have created that structure before in my life, but after learning and being a part of structured education, I now realize that I can structure my own education in a more effective way, probably even than my universities or my schools could, because I know what I'm interested in learning and how to go about it
Yeah.
that way. So, and I have ChatGPT now, so that kind of helps.
That helps a little bit.
Yeah. So, you know, what was your experience like? What has your experience been like in this degree? Obviously, you're done with most of the coursework now, and you're working on an internship. But what was the
Mhm.
biggest surprise for you coming out of sports science and into this data science realm?
Sure. I would say the biggest, well, I'll start the biggest, it's not a surprise, but the biggest adaptation was definitely the coding element of things because sports science, when you do your assignment work, it's a lot of theory stuff, a lot of write ups, reading papers. And now this was more of implementing things, building things. So that was definitely a shift, a slight shift. And now going into the actual internship, which is also a, this was a surprise for sure, is because before I was doing self-taught work, actually let me roll back one more. When I was working as a freelance sports scientist, I was working alone, then I did self-taught, then I was in the university system where it's basically you get an assignment that you have to do yourself. So now when I got into this internship, it was the first time in years where I was collaborating with people as part of a team. So it was a matter of learning to communicate with people in a different way and the importance of going from theoretical learning to applying it in the real world and how much being part of a team factors into that. And one of the most basic things that's an easy win to do for people who are still learning data science is just learn GitHub, just the basics of how to upload stuff and manage your versions and that sort of thing. Because I didn't learn that at any point because there was always individual work, even at university. So there was never any need to do it. And it really doesn't take long to learn literally the basics. So if I had done that, it would have saved a lot of time because what now happened in my internship is that I then went in and coded this NLP thing, this NLP project, and then that needed to be productionized to the company and I didn't know how to use GitHub. So the tech team were waiting on me to upload it and just get it into a centralized place and also to give the variables names that make sense to everybody and not just myself. So just those little things where you just learn to work in a team rather than an individual are super valuable and underrated.
Yeah, GitHub is super, super valuable skill. Or using Git maybe is, you can use whatever web repository you want, but Git, the infrastructure is unbelievably important. I mean, that's something that I recommend for people if they want to differentiate in the job market is do a
Yeah,
project with other people. So I go every when I used to hire, I haven't hired anyone in a couple of years now, but I
yeah,
was doing maybe 7, 8 interviews a week hiring at one of the companies I used to work at. And if I
yeah,
saw that someone had collaborated with other people on GitHub, their GitHub wasn't just for creating a portfolio, it had the function that it was used for, which is versioning with the team. That was a big eye opener because that's something you have to do every day in the workforce.
yeah,
And
for sure.
if you can fabricate that, or you're doing projects with your friends for fun, that suggests to any employer that you could also do that for the team, especially if you're following really good best practices. I want to rewind just a little bit though. So, how did you end up landing that internship? What was that process for you like? Because I can imagine, there's it's a competitive space and
Yeah.
internships don't necessarily come easy.
Sure. So my master's is actually a 2 year master's, as you've sort of alluded to before. So it's 1 year of learning, and then the second year is meant to be an internship. But if you don't have an internship, you can just cut out the second year and just do your dissertation instead. So what that means is that you pretty much have to have your internship sorted fairly early because the academic year starts in September and ends in around July. So what that means is from as early as October, November, people were applying for internships. So I started applying around December, and it was a little bit tricky, but luckily the projects that we had done in class, when we put them on GitHub, they were difficult enough where it would show employers that you knew at least the fundamentals of coding, because a lot of them weren't really real life applicable, but they were very fundamental. The class was called fundamentals of coding, so it was stuff like building a clustering algorithm with no libraries, with just pandas and numpy, that sort of thing, where you had to really learn the intricacies of Python. So that would look good on a CV. And it was just a matter of just putting them onto online. Basically, I made a personal website on Squarespace. I'm not sure whether that played a big role at all, but I did it anyway and threw my projects on there. And it is a pretty tough space because as soon as an internship goes live, if you're like 3 days late to applying, it's probably already taken down, just because there's so many people searching for internships. So one thing I did was try to play to my own strengths. So earlier in my career, I had been in social media marketing. So what I did was look for companies which were in the marketing realm, because then I could show off a little bit of domain knowledge. It wasn't very much because I was very young when I was doing that, but it was a little bit. So just something to try and differentiate myself. So I began to initially it was more of a shotgun approach, where I was just applying to anything that came out. Then I slowed it down and began to be more focused, look for jobs where my past skill sets can more easily be translated or be differentiators compared to people who hadn't worked in those domains at all. And then also spending a little bit more time researching the companies, not just going on the about page, pick out a sentence here and there, but just spending a little bit more time. It doesn't have to be hours and hours, but just taking a little bit more time to know the company a lot better, especially when you think it's a higher percentage chance that you land that job based on your current experience. So it was a matter of doing that across different job websites. You know, you have your LinkedIn, Glassdoor, Indeed. Those were the big three that I was using, and just getting the numbers out and going through the interview process and the technical process while still trying to balance your coursework is not the easiest thing. But I think it's definitely worth it once you land that internship, because personally, I've learned so much more in my internship than I did in my university year. And I did learn loads in my university year. So I'll say getting that hands on experience through an internship can be really helpful.
So something you described just now is that you got more from the internship than the university year. for people who are self-learning, you can do the same thing. Essentially, you can find an opportunity. It could be for free, it could be paid to provide data services or analysis or whatever it might be, and you can get those learnings right out of the gate. I mean, it might
Yeah.
be a little bit more difficult. I find that internships are easier if you're currently in school, because companies realize that they don't have to make necessarily a large commitment because it's inevitably going to end when you go back to school, or when they extend you an offer or whatever that might be. But the value is in that applied experience. And I think that, maybe one of the failings of self-study for you and for me when I was starting out was that we didn't have anything to apply the things that we were learning to. And obviously projects are good, but a real world scenario with higher stakes compounds that learning even more. And it's one of these things where you have to work really hard to get those opportunities, but they might also be hiding in places that you don't expect. I mean, you don't necessarily need an internship at a big company. You could, if your
Hmm.
parents own a market or like a little convenience store, you can do analysis for them. They have data that they're collecting. A lot of
Yeah.
these, you know, any store you go to has a point of sale system that collects some form of data. You know, there's very likely someone in everyone's network that has a data problem. They just don't know it yet. They're collecting data in some way. I've been on this farm kick recently quite a bit. And I've been watching a lot of, farm YouTube videos. And a lot of these farmers, they collect data on all of their crops, the returns, everything about the domain they're in. And I had half a mind to be
Interesting.
like, hey, you tell me about farming, I'll analyze your data for you and see if I can help you find some additional trends.
Oh, that sounds
Clear,
yeah.
easy transaction, right? But it's a matter of realizing that those opportunities to do analysis like that are out there, and those are things you can directly put on a resume. And
Yeah.
they're real. You could even, in theory, get paid for some of those or get some sort of value exchange. So I think so many people think that getting an internship or getting real experience is hard, but there are these opportunities out there, probably right in front of our noses, that we're just too afraid to ask about, or just we don't think that, we just think we'll get rejected. But you really never know unless you
Yeah.
unless you ask, right?
For sure. Being able to put yourself out there, I think is a really big skill, especially when you're early in your career. I didn't I went the traditional route of just applying for a job, but 100% being able to go to people and just offer your services, I think that is a super useful way, because maybe I wouldn't have had the foresight to do that a year ago when I was still applying. But like, let's say if I was in that situation, knowing what I know now, what you just described, where you just literally go to companies and say, guys, what data stuff can I help you with? I think you could get a lot done. So I agree with that.
For sure. So something I'm interested in, if I recall correctly, you're working at more of a startup type company.
Hmm.
How what is their comfort level with using ChatGPT? Is that something that you're discouraged from using? Is that something that they're recommending you use? And as someone who's maybe more freshly learned data science, what do you think about it in terms of how it's interacting with the field?
So my company is they're very accepting of technologies and look to utilize it as much as they can. So literally a couple of days after it got released to the wider public, when maybe not that many people were aware about it, it was already hot in the Slack. Everybody was talking about the different things that they could use it for. And that goes from the creative department, who are now using, I think Photoshop just revealed their AI today, and or not today,
It's
but
pretty
this
sick.
week.
It was a couple days ago,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, oh, I've used it a couple of times. It's amazing. But already people in the creative department are using that. People in the data department were also straight on that. So I would say the company is really happy to use that sort of thing, especially in a startup where you might not be able to scale the number of employees you have. The easiest thing is to scale the amount of work that each employee can do. So they're very forward with ChatGPT. Although one thing I did suggest is that they should just get plus for everybody on on the company dime, but that hasn't happened yet. Um, but as a newbie data scientist, I'm actually I can say I'm very glad that it did not come out a year earlier when I was in university because it did force me to go through those long slogs in the library where now I do know some fundamentals of coding that perhaps if ChatGPT had been around a year ago, I would have done a little bit, then gotten help and be like, oh yeah, I would have figured that out with enough time. But not having ChatGPT forced me to confront those weaknesses. So that's one thing that I'm really happy about. But at the moment, as an employee, it's interacting really well for me because all it's done is just skyrocket my productivity. Like I remember there was this one time where I had to build a predictive model. However, the data was stored in a SQL database, and I needed to build this really complex query that I just couldn't wrap my head around. I tried it for like 6 hours on that day. I tried Stack Overflow, and there was just no way of getting around it. I literally just had to sit down and figure it out until it was working. And I was just thinking to myself, I wish there was some tool that could just make this whole process easier. And now we have it. So I would say it's really good for the productivity, but I'm very interested to see what it's going to be like going forward. I'm not sure how the universities have adapted so far because I know all the coding projects that we did last year that took me hours in the library, you could do it in like 15 minutes on ChatGPT. So I'm not sure how it's affecting students, whether the students are still taking the time to learn to code, because even in my position at times, I do catch myself getting lazy where I'm just copy pasting and not even properly comprehending the solution that ChatGPT has given me. So I actively have to guard against that to make sure that I understand what's going on. Because inevitably, when you're applying for your next job, there's probably going to be a technical interview. And if you've been using ChatGPT the whole time, you might be in a world of trouble when it comes to trying to figure these problems out for yourself. So I would say it's very interesting times. Uh, Although from what I can see so far, it hasn't affected the newbie job market yet. It's still relatively fresh, and this is just anecdotal from my observation, so don't take my word for it. But I'll say that's the situation I see at the moment. I'm very curious to see how it continues to develop.
Yeah, you said something about how it might affect the newbie job market. What are you trying to do, or what skills are you trying to learn to sort of hedge yourself as you start looking for full time jobs, as you start continuing to develop this career? Because to me, that's something that I'm thinking a lot about is how do you differentiate now that it's so much easier to do a project, it's so much easier to output code. Um, I don't know the answer, but I'm interested in what your perspective is because you're having to live this more than I am.
Sure. So I might not know the answer per se, but I can just say what my plan will be. And I have to say will be in future tense because at the moment I have a dissertation on as well. So it's hard to keep up with everything. But it's to not shy away from AI basically and become really good at integrating AI to solve data problems. Because I think that if you're able to show that you can say you can solve data problems in the traditional way with just pure code and just doing a project, but then also show that you're able to leverage AI to do that much more effectively and not just that you know how to copy paste from ChatGPT, which is what everybody can do, but show that you can actually build it into a tool that actually has, more importantly, real world application. So not just something generic where it's like, oh, this is now 94% accurate instead of 93%. But just getting as real world applicable as possible is going to be my plan. And I feel like this year in industry where I've had to focus on real world more has helped me to differentiate what is useful more in theory than in business application, because now for the past year basically I've gone from thinking of everything from how can I get as high a mark as possible on this coursework to how can I generate as much business value as possible by doing this project. So if you're able to leverage ChatGPT or whatever AI tool you're using to then provide higher business value, I think that will be a way to differentiate yourself basically.
I think that's a
Because
very
Yeah.
wise approach. Go ahead.
I was going to say, because when before ChatGPT came out, I would just always wish that I started data science a little bit earlier, because so that I could be more established in a position like, let's say, you and more experienced data scientists. If I had skipped the whole sports science stage and just become really dedicated to it. So now this might actually be an opportunity, a second wind of sorts, where we're sort of resetting to a certain extent, because now everybody has AI available to them. So now there's an opportunity to become amazing at integrating AI to solve data problems. So I'm trying to view it from a more optimistic lens.
I think that it's a great way to view it. Something that is I'm very conscientious about is that the volume of code, the volume of projects is going to increase dramatically because it's so much easier now. But that doesn't mean that the value that's created from those projects also increases in the same manner. I mean, people, when they're hiring, they care about results. And so if you're able to build things that people use and also solve problems, that is going to be the holy grail for one, making yourself money, but two, also landing a job. So if, for example, I build something as a toy project that gets 1,000 users every month, that means a lot to companies. That means you've built something that other people are using. That's exactly
Yeah,
what companies are looking for. If you, even if it's for a small niche community, that's inherently valuable. Better yet, if you're able to monetize that and you say, hey, I've created an AI product that people spend money on, you're killing two birds with one stone because you're creating revenue for yourself and you're also improving your opportunities in the job market. And so I am always focused. If I were to be applying for jobs, I'm always focused on return from the projects that I do, because unfortunately, for better or for worse in the business world, it is all about return on investment, return on time. It can be non-financial return. Like you can get free time or you get time back by saving yourself with like a calendar plugin, right? Calendly has
yeah,
probably saved me, you know, 100 hours over the last 3 years because it saves the back and forth emails that people send, right? So that, even
yeah,
if it's not financially returning, it can be returning in other ways. But I would frame every project in the scope of what does this return? Who is this creating value for? And being really specific about that, because unfortunately, I think, or fortunately, I think AI levels the playing field for data scientists in a way that business knowledge and sort of entrepreneurship start reigning more supreme in that domain. So if you can flex those skills and create things that other people will use, you get a massive advantage because coding is essentially very close to being leveled, right? The an incredible top 1% coder is
yeah,
probably just a little bit better than me using ChatGPT, and I'm probably significantly faster than they are writing code with ChatGPT. So,
yeah,
what does that mean? What we have to index on if you're looking for a job? Other things than coding purely, which is
yeah,
either
for sure.
good or bad depending on how you look at it. For me, it's great
Yeah.
because I don't love coding like that.
Well, yeah, I 100% agree. I was just thinking about this recently, and domain knowledge, I think the importance of it has to rise, right? Because it's like those levers where before, just the fact that you could code, which was such a rare skill, meant that you were intrinsically valuable. You can't just lean on the ability to code as much to get you a job. You need to add other tools to the arsenal and build a more holistic person, essentially.
Yeah, here's a hot take that I think is really valuable. If you're in college, if you're looking for a job, start a side hustle. A side hustle is probably the single best thing that will land you a job, or it'll
Interesting.
usurp the need for you to get a job in the first place. Because, for example, let's take YouTube that you're doing. Probably has helped you with visibility for landing a job. Probably at the point where you're starting to make some cash flow as well. You've established yourself as somewhat of a thought leader in the space. there's no detraction from what you're doing. It has only helped you. And in theory, if things continue to go really well for you on YouTube, that might replace the need for a job in the long run if you didn't want to work a more traditional job. So you've made yourself more employable and you've created a form of cash flow. Why wouldn't you do that? And even if you tried, you learn
Yeah,
valuable skills. So it
for
just
sure.
makes total sense to me. So shifting gears in that same vein, let's talk a little bit about YouTube and your journey. Like, why did you start? What has been the focus of that?
Wow. So, one of the main reasons I started is what we've spoken about before, where that journey to mastery, to show that with enough time anybody can become pretty good at a skill. So I've always loved YouTube and watching people on YouTube, whether it was data science or whatever niche of YouTube it was, right? So I've watched people like yourself, Luke, Tina, all the big data science people. And from the outside looking in, I always felt like you guys were super smart, like these geniuses. So that always made me a little bit wary of like, could I do this? Like, I don't think I'm dumb, but I don't think I'm as smart as them. Then eventually I was like, okay, what takes them 10 hours? Maybe it will take me 20 hours to do. However, with enough time and effort, I will get decent at this, right? And I want to show other people who were in my position before that, hey, if you don't think you can do it, here's a backlog of a channel of this guy who could barely code. He spent 8 hours in the library to write two functioning lines of code. And hopefully by the time they look at that, I'm in a pretty decent position and I'm genuinely good at data science. I'm still on that journey. Obviously, I'm still in the beginning phases. And I think that could provide a lot of motivation for people. But there's also benefits for me, such as one thing I wanted to improve was my ability to communicate and present. And what better way to do that than going on camera and forcing yourself to watch yourself back, going, or just realizing that you say a lot of filler words, and then it gives you a video way to see elements that you could improve. And like you've mentioned, it also helps with visibility and growing your network and that sort of thing. So those are the main reasons that I've started YouTube, to be honest. And also it's just fun because I had my fun during university going out and stuff. And this is just a different hobby, which is significantly cheaper.
It's funny that you are making YouTube to say that, if I can do it, other people can do it, because that's why I started YouTube too. And it's funny to hear someone else say, oh, it seems like Ken is so smart and all these things. I look at my journey as a journey of struggling with things and learning them and then trying to share the things that I really struggled with other people so they can have an easier time. And something I've learned about YouTube creation or content creation in general is people love the journey. They don't care about getting advice or recommendations. They care about the value it can create for them, absolutely. But if you're struggling with something, sharing that with other people, it either helps them work through the same thing or it lets them know that it's not easy as well. And that there's definitely, I say it all the time, there's things I can improve upon. I am by no means perfect, but what's important is that I'm trying and I'm
Yeah.
I'm incrementally getting better. And in some sense, it's very nice to hear from you that you look at me that way, because I definitely don't look at myself that way, right? Which is always a hoot in general. Um, no, amazing. I'm excited to see where your career and also where your content goes. I've been enjoying the videos. The production quality is dramatically improved over time, which has been pretty impressive as well. Um, Something that you'd mentioned is that you wanted to ask me a couple questions towards the end, and I'm happy
Yes.
to take those as well if you're interested.
Yes, I would love to
All right, we'll
ask you some
turn the
questions
script.
for the newbies to bring you back to your roots.
Of
So
course.
it's just three or four. So what are the biggest changes besides AI that you've seen in data science from the beginning of your career to now? Just general things.
So a big thing that's changing right now is the trend towards data engineering, trend towards specialization with ML engineering and ML ops as well. So data science historically was a very broad term. It encapsulated a lot of those things. Companies are realizing that they hired for data scientists and they didn't have high quality data, or it was very messy, or it was unstructured. And in order for those data scientists to be effective, they needed to hire data engineers, and a lot of them. So there's been a massive, I wouldn't say shift, but there's been a push for companies to really get their data infrastructure figured out better so that data scientists, machine learning engineers can be more effective at their job. So I would say that maybe the balloon is squeezed from data scientists more towards data engineers in the short term. And then I think we're going to see the value of data scientists or more specialized people like ML engineers become increasingly popular down the road. I will also say that that has made the job market for the domain a little bit different. I mean, people are
Interesting.
indexing on a different skill set than they were previously, which is more akin to data engineering or software engineering, because data engineers and software engineers build concrete things. It's easier to calculate return on investment or see use cases in those. Data scientists build things that are less concrete with unclear payout, and it's harder to get funding for those in tight environments. So I'm interested in the domain moving forward because it seems like, one, it is becoming more specialized, and two, there's more of this focus on return in tight economies. And if I was new to this field, I would consider exploring maybe the data engineering side just a little bit more, because having those
Interesting.
skills also increases your ability to land a data science job dramatically.
Interesting. So, what are some underrated skills that data scientists could pick up, which are not just like coding or being good at maths?
I think like working with Spark is pretty useful. Doing like these massive data jobs, understanding how AWS, Google, and Azure work. Just working with these massive cloud platforms is something that a lot more data scientists are doing. Students, I believe, get a bunch of free credits to be able to do this, and if you can do a project using these, it can go a really long way. I also think that learning the AI tools is very, very useful and compelling. Just becoming really good at those and learning how to prompt, learning how to get exactly what you want out of working. I use ChatGPT mostly, but there's plenty of other tools that are comparable or work in a similar fashion, especially for coding. I think understanding how to code at a core is really useful, but I also see us sort of moving away from specific programming languages. So
Yeah.
I think AI makes it so that we're programming language agnostic. We still have to understand how pseudocode works and the sort of framework behind how programming works, but what language we code in 3 4 years might not even matter, in my opinion.
Interesting. Oh, I hadn't even considered that. So actually, you touched on one interesting point that I'd like to dig in to a little bit more. If you were, let's say, the position I was a year ago, or just somebody who is beginning, how important is it to be able to code without the assistance of AI? Or do you think you should just focus on becoming good at coding with AI rather than specifically coding?
That's a question I don't know the answer to. No, I don't really know
Mm,
how the future looks. Realistically, if I was starting over right now, I would spend as much of my time as possible building things. So, something that I think a lot of people don't realize is, as humans, we care most about actions and results. So I can't see how much you've studied by looking at you, right? I can't be like,
yeah,
oh, he spent 40 hours studying this past week, but I can see how much output you have if you have a GitHub profile. And so
yeah,
those actions by putting things on GitHub, the actions of seeing all of those green boxes filled up on GitHub that you're working on it every day, or on Kaggle having the the blue boxes all filled up, that is very meaningful, especially if I can see the results of your code. So if you told me that I had two candidates, one that had an absurd amount of output, even if it was AI assisted, and one that studied and knew all the theory perfectly well, but didn't have any output, I would choose the person who's built stuff 100% of the time. So in that very canned scenario,
Yeah.
like myopically, that's how I would view it. But as a somewhat of a purist, I still think it's important to know how to code and know the underlying mechanisms. But that could very well change in the next couple of years.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's
So with what we know right now, you should
yeah.
learn how to code the basics first. I reserve the right to change that opinion in 2-3 years from now.
Sure. Yeah, I'll be waiting for that updated video to see if that's changed at all. And the last one, I know we've already touched on this, but I would love to hear you dig into it properly, which is basically domain knowledge and just the value that can be gotten from that and how important it is versus coding and that sort of thing.
So I have mixed feelings on this. So something
Mm,
I find very interesting is on Kaggle, most of the people that have won the sports specific competitions know nothing about the sports at all.
yeah.
And to me, that's slightly painful because that suggests that in some circumstances, domain knowledge is not as important as I previously thought. On the other hand, the people who framed the question for those Kaggle competitions were very likely sports people. So I think domain knowledge is particularly relevant for defining the questions that you want to ask of the data. And data analysis, data science can be slightly agnostic to that as long as you have a really good frame of what the question is and what the assumptions are. So again, on Kaggle, there's someone who has great domain knowledge who's framing the question and the assumptions, but it can be almost agnostic to data scientists um, if that part has been taken care of. So, you know, if you're thinking about how this is relevant to your own life, is work on projects that you have great domain knowledge of because
Yeah.
you can frame the exact questions in a way that it will be compelling for an end user. Get help from people who are really good coders or really good data scientists who have no subject area knowledge, but be the person to frame that question. So that's how I would sort of uh, flip that understanding for people.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I think that's all the questions I had. And that domain knowledge answer has really given me a lot to think about because I had just committed myself to thinking that domain knowledge was the most important thing ever. But you've definitely given me an alternative take to think about.
Yeah. Well, if you're thinking about getting results, the
Mm,
most important thing that you can do is ask the right question or solve the right problem. So domain knowledge, in my opinion, is one of the most important things. But on the other side of that, it's only super important in that specific area. Again, if you can define this question, have all the correct assumptions, and make it so other people that problem is scalable to other people, those other people who don't have that domain knowledge, they might think about things completely. Like sometimes we're cornered by our own domain knowledge where, oh, I know this doesn't happen ever in basketball. So why would I expect it to happen any different otherwise when maybe the game of
yeah.
basketball has changed and it does happen now. So I think that that's something that, you know, having other diverse opinions can really be valuable in helping to understand. So I learned that too. I didn't really think of that until you just mentioned it. So that's the whole benefit of a long form podcast is
Yeah.
I don't know what the hell is going to come out of my mouth, and sometimes I learn something from myself.
See, I told you
Nash,
you're
this
smart,
is
Ken. You surprised yourself.
oh yeah. Well, maybe that's the subconscious, not the conscious brain. So, um, so sometimes my mouth just goes, and the rest of my head isn't paying attention. But Nash, this was awesome. I learned so much. Sometimes when I'm a little bit more advanced in my career, since I'm a bit more advanced in my career, I lose sight of or lose distance or lose relevance to understand the problems of people that are more early in their career. So this is an awesome refresher for me. Hopefully you learned some things. Hopefully, I definitely did learn some things. So again, I really appreciated the time, and I'm excited for this to come out. How can people learn more about you, potentially get in touch with you if that's something you're open to?
Sure. Just on YouTube, Data Nash. I'm always sure to respond to all of the comments, so you can just always get in touch with me there.
Amazing. I will leave the link to that in the description of the video and in the show notes. So again, thank you so much. This was awesome.
Cheers, Ken.